Israel, the detonator for World War I-II, or God's promised land? The question hung in the air of my small Jerusalem apartment, shimmering in the heat haze that distorted the view of the old city's walls from my window. It wasn't just a question, it was the title of my manuscript, The Ghost I Had Come Here to Chase. It was the fault line running directly through my own heart. My name is Elias Cohen, and this land of impossible contradictions is written in my blood. My father, a secular Jew from New York, saw in the Star of David a miracle of defiance and survival. My mother, a Palestinian Christian from Bethlehem, saw in it the shadow that fell over her family's home in 1948. They gave me a life in America, a safe distance from the epicenter, but they also gave me this permanent, internal war. A siren began to wail in the distance. It was a familiar sound in Jerusalem, a sound that always forced a moment of calculation. Was it an ambulance, racing through the choked streets toward a medical emergency? Or was it the other kind, the Tseva Adom, the rising and falling cry that signaled incoming rockets? You held your breath. You listened to the pitch. This one was steady, a single piercing note, an ambulance. I let out the breath I didn't realize I was holding, my fingers pausing over the keyboard. Evan Peace here felt borrowed, temporary. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the balcony. The air was a thick cocktail of diesel fumes from the egged buses, the sweet scent of baking ka'ak bread from a stall down the street, and the ancient dusty smell of sun-baked limestone. Below, the city thrummed with a nervous energy that was its lifeblood. A group of young armed IDF soldiers, their faces beaded with sweat under their helmets, watched a crowd of Palestinian youths near the Damascus Gate. Tourists in wide-brimmed hats navigated the chaos, oblivious, their cameras clicking, capturing a surface-level beauty while missing the tectonic plates grinding just beneath their feet. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Yusuf, my mother's cousin, an old man with eyes that held the entire weary history of his people. The coffee is ready, and the news is bad, as always. Lonan, I found him in his small antiquity shop, a cavern of cool shadows tucked into a narrow alleyway, smelling of cardamom and old wood. The walls were lined with olive wood carvings, Roman glass, and faded maps of a Palestine that no longer existed on any official atlas. Elias, he greeted me, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He handed me a tiny cup of thick, dark coffee. You look troubled. Your book is fighting you. The book is me, Yusuf. It's always fighting me, I admitted, taking a sip. The bitter liquid was a jolt to the system. They came again this morning, he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. He didn't need to specify who they were. To the grove, my brother's grove, near Nablus. They say it's state land now. They handed him a paper, all in Hebrew he cannot read. They will build a new outpost there. He gestured with his chin to a small framed photograph on the counter. It showed a younger Yusuf and his brother, their arms around each other, standing before a gnarled ancient olive tree. That tree was planted by my great-grandfather. It has fed our family for 100 years. How can it be state land? What state? Not ours. This was the conflict in its most elemental form. Not a headline about geopolitics, but a story of a tree, a family, a piece of paper that could erase a century of history. This was the fuel, the dry tinder that lay everywhere, waiting for a spark. I'm sorry, Yusuf, I said, the words feeling hollow and useless. He just shrugged, a gesture of profound resignation. It is the way, but every time they take a tree, they plant a seed of hate in a young man's heart, and they wonder why the fire never goes out. I left his shop and walked back towards the seam line, the invisible but heavily fortified border between West and East Jerusalem. The air felt different here, heavier. I thought of the maps on my wall, the ones showing not ancient history, but modern military deployments. Israel, a fortress nation, surrounded. To the north, Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed with over 100,000 rockets, a proxy army funded and directed by Tehran. To the northeast, Syria, a shattered state now, a playground for foreign powers, where Israeli jets and Iranian Revolutionary Guards played a deadly game of cat and mouse. To the south, Hamas in Gaza, a cage of 2 million people simmering with rage, sporadically launching rockets, provoking a devastating response. And at the center of it all, the great shadow, Iran, a regime that openly called for Israel's destruction, inching ever closer to a nuclear weapon. I recalled a conversation with a retired Mossad officer I'd interviewed for the book. "It's not a Cold War, Elias," he'd told me, his voice a gravelly whisper over whiskey. "It's a hot war fought in the shadows. Every cyber attack, every explosion at a nuclear facility in Natanz, every assassinated scientist, these are battles. We are fighting to delay the inevitable. But a miscalculation. One stray missile, one dead general, too many, and the shadows will ignite. It won't be a regional war. America will be pulled in. Russia is already in Syria. You have the world's superpowers, nuclear-armed, with their soldiers standing yards from each other. It's the most dangerous chessboard on Earth." My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a news alert from a major international agency. Flash. Israeli officials confirm overnight airstrike deep inside Syria. Target believed to be a high-level Iranian Quds Force commander overseeing weapons transfers to Hezbollah. I stopped walking. The distant siren I'd heard earlier, was it just an ambulance? Or had it been a precursor, a ripple from this very event? The spark. Yusuf's words echoed in my head. They wonder why the fire never goes out. I looked up at the ancient stones of the Jaffa Gate, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. Surveillance cameras, like metallic vultures, stared down from their perches. This city had been conquered and destroyed dozens of times. It had been the focal point of crusades, jihads, and empires. But this felt different. The stakes were no longer just for a city or a piece of land. The fuses lit here were now connected to the arsenals of global powers. The retired officer was right. This was the chessboard, and a major piece had just been violently swept from the board. I could almost feel the ground beneath my feet begin to tremble. The news alert felt like a physical blow, a confirmation of the silent, simmering war that defined this place. The golden light of Jerusalem suddenly seemed brittle, a fragile veneer over a chasm of violence. My feet carried me away from the old city, moving automatically, seeking a different reality. I had a standing invitation, a promise I'd made to my father's old friend, David, Shabbat dinner. In the face of a potential escalation, the simple act of joining a family for a meal felt like an act of defiance, a desperate grasp for the other side of the coin. David lived in Rehavia, a leafy, quiet neighborhood in West Jerusalem. The transition was jarring. Here, the air was calmer, the streets wider. Bauhaus-style apartment buildings stood next to modern glass-fronted homes. Children on bicycles raced down sidewalks, their laughter echoing in the twilight. It was a different Israel, the one you see in brochures, the Israel of normalcy, of families, of life, lived not in the shadow of conflict, but in the sunshine of its success. This was the dream my father had championed. The warmth from David and Miriam's apartment spilled out into the hallway before they even opened the door. It was the scent of roasted chicken and honey cake, the low hum of conversation. When Miriam, a woman with a kind face and a fire in her eyes, pulled me into a hug, I felt some of the day's tension melt away. "Elias, we were worried you'd forgotten us," she said, her voice a melody of welcome. Inside, the scene was a portrait of sacred peace. 2 candles, lit by Miriam just as the sun had set, flickered on the dining table, their light dancing on the polished silver and the braided golden crust of the challah bread. David, a professor of history with a salt and pepper beard, was in the middle of blessing the wine, his voice a deep, resonant Hebrew that felt as old as the stones outside. Their son, Ari, a tall young man with his father's contemplative eyes and the coiled readiness of a warrior, stood beside him. He was home on leave from his elite combat unit, His uniform was gone, replaced by a simple white shirt, but the bearing remained. He was the protector of this peace, the living embodiment of the paradox. To life, L'chaim, David declared, raising his glass. The family echoed him, and the meal began. For an hour, the world of airstrikes and proxy wars ceased to exist. Here, there was only the rhythm of tradition, the washing of hands, the breaking of bread, the stories, the laughter. Miriam spoke of her grandmother arriving from Poland after the war, with nothing but a recipe book and a fierce determination to rebuild. She used to say that God promised us this land, but he expected us to do the work, Miriam explained, her gaze meeting mine. Every time we plant a garden, build a school, or light these candles, we are fulfilling our end of the bargain. This isn't just a political state, Elias. For us, it's the answer to a 2000-year-old prayer. It is the tangible proof of God's memory. David chimed in, wiping his beard with a napkin. Miriam is the poet, I am the pragmatist. But we see the same miracle. Forget the prayers for a moment and look at the science. We took a land that was mostly swamp and desert and turned it into a breadbasket. Our desalination plants provide water from the sea. Our medical technology is saving lives around the world. We are the startup nation because we had no choice. We had to innovate or perish. That spirit, that refusal to be erased, that is the essence of modern Israel. It is the resurrection of a people who were supposed to be a footnote in history books. He was right. I saw it every day. The brilliant minds at Hebrew University, the tech incubators in Tel Aviv, the agricultural wonders of the Negev. It was a story of incredible human achievement, a testament to resilience forged in the crucible of tragedy. This was the promised land, not just as a theological concept, but as a living, breathing, thriving reality, a haven. But the haven had high walls and armed guards. I finally found the courage to mention the news. Did you hear about the strike in Syria? The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. The warmth didn't vanish, but it was joined by a familiar chill. Ari's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. It was David who answered, his voice losing its professorial calm and taking on a harder edge. We heard, a necessary action. They move advanced GPS components for missiles, Elias. Missiles they aim at our homes. At this home, they funnel them to Hezbollah, who have one goal, our annihilation. Do you think we want to do this? We want to build, to create. But when your neighbor is standing at your fence with a torch and a can of gasoline, you don't offer him a cup of coffee. You build a higher fence, and you make damn sure he knows you have a fire extinguisher and the will to use it. We pray for the safety of our soldiers, Miriam added softly, her eyes glancing toward Ari. And we pray for the day when they will not have to go. Ari remained silent for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, devoid of bravado. In basic training, they teach you to shoot, to fight, to win. But the rabbis who visit us, they teach us something else. They teach us about Toha Haneshek, the purity of arms. The idea that you use your weapon only when you must, and with the heaviest of hearts. We fight so that families like ours can have Shabbat dinner. That's the mission. We don't fight because we hate what is in front of us, but because we love what is behind us. His words struck me with profound force. We love what is behind us. This room, this family, this 2,000-year-old prayer, this was the promised land. It was a concept so powerful, so deeply felt, that people were willing to kill and die for it. And in that moment I understood the terrifying, unbreakable link between the two halves of my title. The fierce love that created this peaceful Shabbat table was the very same force that authorized the lethal airstrike in Syria. The promise was the justification for the sword. I left their home late that night, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting truths. Walking back through the silent streets of Rahavia, I looked up at the sky. Above the quiet homes, the stars were brilliant in the clear desert air. For Miriam, they were the same stars God had shown to Abraham as a sign of his eternal covenant. But I knew that high above those stars, invisible to the naked eye, military satellites were passing overhead, American, Russian, Israeli, Iranian watching, listening, targeting. The ancient promise and the modern threat occupying the very same sky. The land was holy, the dream was real, but the price was a perpetual state of war. And I couldn't shake the chilling thought that one day the price might become too high for the entire world to pay. The following morning, Jerusalem awoke to a fragile, unnerving silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. I sat at my desk, the manuscript for my book open but unread. The words felt foolish, academic, completely unequal to the raw, visceral tension that had seized the city. My screen was a mosaic of news feeds. Tehran was a sea of black flags and furious faces. The funeral of the slain Quds Force commander broadcast live across the globe. The chants were guttural, a rhythmic promise of revenge. Mag bar Israel, Mag bar America, death to Israel, death to America. It wasn't political rhetoric anymore. It was a vow. In Washington, a stern-faced press secretary spoke of de-escalation while announcing the repositioning of naval assets in the Persian Gulf. In Moscow, the foreign ministry called for restraint from all parties, a piece of diplomatic theater that everyone knew was meaningless. The world was holding its breath with us. Unable to sit still, I walked toward the Mahane Yehuda market, needing to lose myself in the chaos of life. The shuk was a full-blown assault on the senses, a vibrant counterpoint to the sterile tension of the news cycle. Vendors bellowed the prices of glistening olives and pyramids of fragrant spices. The air was thick with the smell of fresh fish, sizzling falafel, and sweet, sticky rugelach baking in industrial ovens. It was life at its most boisterous and resilient. A butcher, his apron stained with blood, argued good-naturedly with a customer over a cut of meat. Teenagers laughed as they shared a bag of sunflower seeds. This was the life Ari had spoken, of the life he fought to protect. I found a small table at a cafe on the edge of the market. The television on the wall was muted, but it showed the same images from Tehran, angry, grieving crowds. It was surreal to watch this display of pure hatred while, just a few feet away, a young mother was gently feeding her toddler a spoonful of yogurt. The two realities existed side by side, a hair's breadth apart, and the membrane separating them felt terrifyingly thin. Then it happened. It didn't start with a sound, it started with a vibration. My phone, and the phones on every other table, began to buzz and shriek in unison. A cacophony of custom ringtones and emergency alerts. I looked at my screen, my blood turning to ice. Rocket alert, Kiryat Shmona. Rocket alert, Metula. Rocket alert, Upper Galilee region. A wave of red notifications one after another. The north, Hezbollah's territory. This wasn't a lone rocket from Gaza. This was a barrage. The retaliation had begun. The noisy cafe fell instantly silent. The only sounds were the frantic tapping of fingers on screens and the muted television, which had now switched to a live news broadcast. The cheerful chatter was replaced by a collective gasp, followed by a torrent of panicked Hebrew. A woman at the next table cried out, "My sister lives in Kiryat Shmona," and fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking too much to dial. The butcher left his stand and stood in the alleyway, staring at the sky as if he could see the rockets from here. The thin membrane had just been torn open. My first thought was of Ari. My hands felt clumsy, my own fingers trembling as I scrolled through my contacts and pressed David's name. The line was busy. I tried again. Busy. A cold dread began to creep up my spine. The professor's words from last night, so full of righteous certainty, now seemed like a terrible prelude. You make damn sure he knows you have a fire extinguisher. But what happens when the whole house is doused in gasoline? On the third try, he answered. The connection was poor, crackling with static. David? Elias. His voice was tight, thin, stripped of all its academic warmth. He sounded like an old man. "David, did you see the news?" A stupid question. "Yes, we are watching." I could hear Miriam weeping in the background, a raw, wounded sound. "Ari," I started, unable to finish the sentence. "They moved his unit up to the Lebanese border last night," David said, his voice flat, as if all the emotion had been burned out of him. As soon as the news of the strike broke. "He's there, Elias. He's up there right now." The casual phrase "he's up there" was suddenly imbued with a terrifying weight. He was in the line of fire. He was the human shield protecting the vibrant market behind me, the laughing children, the Shabbat tables. He was the price of the promised land. On the television screen, the first images started to appear, grainy cell phone footage showing streaks of white smoke climbing into the blue sky, Iron Dome interceptors racing to meet their targets. Then, a different kind of smoke, a dark, ugly plume rising from behind a hill, a direct hit. "We are just waiting," David whispered into the phone, his voice breaking. "There is nothing else we can do. We just sit here, and we wait, and we pray." I thought of his proud declaration, "L'chaim," to life. It felt like a lifetime ago. The life he had toasted was now hanging by the thinnest of threads, a thread that stretched from his quiet Jerusalem apartment all the way to a muddy foxhole on the northern border. I mumbled something, I don't even remember what, and ended the call. I felt disconnected from my own body. I looked at the faces around me in the cafe. The fear was universal. It was the fear of parents, of siblings, of friends. It was the collective trauma of a nation that had never known a generation of true peace. This was the other side of the promise. For every story of a desert blooming, there was a story of a family huddled in a bomb shelter. For every Nobel Prize winner, there was a young soldier paying the ultimate price. A news anchor appeared on the screen, his face grim. He spoke in rapid, urgent Hebrew. I didn't need to understand every word. The key phrases jumped out at me, familiar and dreadful. Nifgaim, casualties, Ptswaim, wounded. Then the phrase that stopped my heart. Arugei Tzahal, IDF fatalities. They had casualties. They had fatalities. The necessary action in Syria had been answered. The cycle had turned once more, and this time it was drawing blood from David and Miriam's world. The abstract geopolitical chessboard had just been overturned, and its pieces were real people. One of them was a young man with contemplative eyes who, just the night before, had spoken of loving what was behind him. And now, none of us knew if he was alive or dead. The hours that followed were a descent into a specific kind of hell, reserved for those who can only wait. The vibrant energy of the Mahane Yehuda market had curdled into a thick soup of anxiety. Strangers shared updates from their phones, huddled around cafe televisions, their faces illuminated by the grim, flickering light of breaking news. The initial rocket barrage from Hezbollah was just the opening salvo. Now came the Israeli response. The low, thunderous roar of fighter jets, scrambling from bases in the south, became the new background noise of Jerusalem, a sound that rattled windows and souls. Each roar was a promise of retribution, a guarantee that the cycle of violence would escalate. I couldn't go back to my empty apartment. It felt like a tomb. Instead, I found myself walking, aimlessly at first, then with a dawning, desperate purpose. I was heading back toward the old city, back toward Yusuf's shop. In this maelstrom of modern warfare, I craved the perspective of something ancient, something that had seen it all before. I needed to see the conflict not through the lens of a television screen, but through the eyes of someone whose family had never left this land. Yusuf was sitting on a low stool just inside the doorway of his shop, a string of amber worry beads moving slowly through his gnarled fingers. He looked up as I approached, his expression unreadable. He had a small, battery-powered radio on the counter beside him, murmuring in Arabic. He was listening to a different war, the same war from the other side. "You have heard the news, of course," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I replied, my voice hoarse. My friend's son, he's a soldier, he's up north. Yusuf nodded slowly, his gaze drifting past me to the alleyway, as if watching ghosts. Every family has a son, on both sides. Today, mothers in Kiryat Shmona weep, and tonight, or tomorrow, mothers in Mar Yayung and Nabatea in southern Lebanon will weep. The bombs do not distinguish. They are very democratic in their work. I sank onto a stool opposite him, the cool air of the shop, a small relief. The scent of cardamom was still there, but today it was mixed with the faint metallic tang of fear that seemed to be seeping in from the streets. They say this is different, Yusuf, I said, repeating the grim analysis of the pundits on television. The target in Syria was a major Iranian general. Hezbollah is not just acting on its own. This is Iran's direct response. This could be it, the big one. Yusuf let out a dry, rasping sound that might have been a laugh. The big one? Elias, for us, it has always been the big one. When my father was forced from his home in Jaffa in 48, that was his big one. When my cousin lost his leg to a sniper in the first Intifada, that was his. When they built the wall, he gestured vaguely toward the east, and cut Bethlehem off from Jerusalem, our holy city. That was our big one. You see, the world only calls it the big one when the powerful are afraid, when America and Russia might get involved. For us, the war has never stopped. It just has quieter days and louder days. Today is a loud day. He set his worry beads down and leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into me. You write in your book about the promised land. A beautiful idea. But a promise from God to one people is a threat to another if they live on the same land. Your friend David, the professor, he sees a miracle of resilience. I see a catastrophe. He sees a desert blooming with technology. I see our olive groves bulldozed for settlements. He sees the resurrection of a nation. I see the dispossession of mine. His radio crackled. A somber voice announced that the Lebanese government was pleading for international intervention, even as Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, was scheduled to give a televised speech that evening. Speech everyone knew would be a declaration of war. Look around you, Elias, Yusuf continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. This city, they call it the City of Peace, but it is the most contested piece of real estate on the planet. For the Jews, it is the heart of their ancient kingdom, the site of their temple. For the Christians, it is the place of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. For us Muslims, it is Al-Quds, our third holiest site, the place of the Prophet's night journey. 3 peoples, 3 faiths, all believing God gave them an exclusive deed to the same small patch of rock. It is a divine mandate for eternal conflict. How can there be peace when God himself is on everyone's side? His words were a cold, sobering counterpoint to Ari's idealism. We fight because we love what is behind us. Yusuf's family also loved what was behind them, their olive groves, their homes in Jaffa, their access to Al-Aqsa, and their young men fought too, with rocks, with guns, with their bodies. The tragedy was not that one side was right and the other wrong. The tragedy was that from their own perspectives, they were both right. Their stories were both true, and their truths were utterly irreconcilable. A sudden commotion from the alleyway made us both look up. A group of Palestinian youths, their faces covered with kafiyehs, ran past the shop, pursued by the shouts of Israeli border police. A moment later, a tear gas canister landed nearby, its acrid smoke billowing into the cool air of the shop, making my eyes burn and my throat constrict. It was a small skirmish, a footnote on a day of cruise missiles and fighter jets, but it was a symptom of the same sickness. The conflict wasn't just on the border, it was in the very heart of the city, in the air they breathed. Yusuf calmly got up, pulled down the metal shutter of his shop, and plunged us into near darkness, the sounds of the street now muffled. "This is how we live," he said, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. "We pull down the shutters and we wait for the storm to pass, or for it to consume us." The world sees a geopolitical powder keg. They see Iran, America, Russia, but they miss the spark. The spark is here. He tapped his chest. It is in the heart of a boy who sees his grandfather's tree uprooted. It is in the memory of a home that is no longer yours. That is a fire that no army can extinguish. In the darkness of that shop, surrounded by the silent artifacts of a lost world, I finally understood. The promised land and the detonator were not two different things. They were the same thing, viewed from opposite sides of a wall. The promise itself, in all its divine, absolute and exclusive glory, was the detonator. Leaving the shuttered darkness of Yusef's shop felt like emerging from a tomb into a world on fire. The tear gas had mostly dissipated, but its ghost lingered in the back of my throat. The sun was setting, casting long dramatic shadows that seemed to claw at the ancient stones of the city. The sky to the west was a beautiful bruised purple, but to the north it held an unnatural flickering orange glow against the deepening twilight. The news feeds confirmed what the glow suggested. Retaliatory Israeli artillery and airstrikes were pounding targets in southern Lebanon. The loud day was becoming a louder night. My phone, which had been silent for hours, suddenly rang. It was David. My heart leaped into my throat. "David, is there news?" "He's alive." The words were choked, raw. "He's alive, Elias." I leaned against a cold stone wall, my legs weak with relief. "Thank God. Is he okay? Is he hurt?" "He's not hurt," David said, and I could hear Miriam's sobs in the background, but this time they were sounds of relief, not grief. His commander called us. The first barrage. It hit a position very close to theirs. They lost 2 men from another platoon. 2 boys, 18, 19 years old. He paused, taking a shaky breath. "Ari is alive, but he's not okay." How can anyone be okay? The relief was immediate but incomplete, stained by the knowledge of those other 2 families who had just received a different kind of call. The 2 young men whose lives were the price paid for this round of the conflict. His commander said they are preparing for a ground incursion, David continued, his voice hardening again, the brief moment of relief already giving way to the next wave of fear. They think they have to go in, to clear out the rocket launchers, to push Hezbollah back from the border. He said Ari's unit will be one of the first to cross. A ground incursion. The words landed like stones in my stomach. Airstrikes were one thing, impersonal, distant, clinical, but a ground war in southern Lebanon was a different beast entirely. It was a place of ghosts for the IDF. A treacherous landscape of fortified villages, hidden tunnels, and brutal close-quarters fighting. It was where the purity of arms met the bloody, muddy reality of ambushes and IEDs. Israel had occupied it for years, a painful bleeding wound that had ended in a hasty withdrawal in 2000. Going back in was a nightmare scenario. "What did Ari say?" I asked, picturing him covered in dust and cordite, his face grim with the loss of his comrades. "We haven't spoken to him," David said. "They've taken their phones. For security. We just have to wait again." The waiting, it was the true torture, the not knowing. As I walked through the darkening streets of West Jerusalem, the atmosphere had transformed. The initial shock had given way to a grim, collective resolve. The cafes were still full, but now the patrons were glued to the news, their conversations hushed and serious. Civil defense volunteers in bright orange vests were directing people to the nearest public bomb shelters, their locations now illuminated on digital signboards. There was a run on bottled water and canned goods at the local supermarkets. This was a nation switching to war footing, a process they knew with a terrible, practiced familiarity. I passed a synagogue where evening prayers had just ended. A group of men stood outside, their prayer shawls still draped over their shoulders, locked in intense debate. I caught snippets of their conversation. "No choice. We have to finish them this time. We cannot live under this threat." but a war with Iran behind them. This is not 2006. The whole region will burn. It is a Milkemet mitzvah, an older man with a long white beard said, his voice firm and clear. A holy war. A compulsory war. A war to defend the people of Israel in the land of Israel. God will be with our soldiers. Here it was again, the divine sanction. The belief that this was not just a strategic decision made by generals and politicians in a Tel Aviv war room, but a sacred duty. This belief was the bedrock of their resilience. It allowed them to send their children, like Ari, into the fire, not just with a sense of patriotism, but with a sense of divine purpose. This was the promised land, demanding its sacrifice. As darkness fell completely, the sirens began to wail again. But this time, it wasn't a distant ambulance or a localized alert for the north. It was here, in Jerusalem. Tseva Adam. Tseva Adam. The rising, falling shriek echoed off the stone buildings, a sound designed to bypass thought and trigger pure, primal fear. For a split second, the city froze. Then, chaos. People screamed, abandoning their cars in the middle of the street, running for the nearest building entrance. The cafe patrons scrambled inside. I was caught out in the open, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind raced. Iron Dome was effective, but not perfect. And Jerusalem, with its holy sites, had long been considered a red line. Targeting Jerusalem was the ultimate escalation. It meant all rules were off. I ducked into the entryway of an apartment building, pressing myself against the wall as others crowded in around me. A young woman was crying hysterically into her phone. An elderly man was calmly reciting a psalm, his eyes closed. We were all strangers, united in a moment of shared terror. We heard it before we felt it. A deep, whistling sound, like the air itself being torn apart. It grew louder, higher, a terrifying crescendo. Then came the boom. Not the sharp crack of an interception, but a deep, gut-wrenching explosion that shook the ground beneath our feet. It was close. A car alarm started shrieking hysterically down the street. The all-clear siren sounded a minute later, a single, sustained note that felt like an anticlimax. People slowly, hesitantly emerged from the shelter of the doorway. A column of black smoke was rising into the night sky, maybe a kilometer away. The attack had reached the holy city. The war was no longer something happening on a distant border, on a television screen. It was here. The detonator had been struck, and the explosion was now radiating outward, shaking the very foundations of the promised land. The conversation was over. The debate had ended. Now, there was only the sound of sirens and the grim, terrifying certainty of what would come next. The rocket that struck Jerusalem changed everything. It was a symbolic act of profane violence, a violation of an unspoken rule. The city, which held its breath during most conflicts, had now been dragged into the center of the storm. The direct hit, as news reports later confirmed, had landed in an empty park in a residential neighborhood, a miracle of luck that prevented mass casualties but did nothing to lessen the psychological impact. A red line had been crossed. Hezbollah, goaded by Iran, had called Israel's bluff. Now, there would be no restraint. My own sanctuary, my small apartment with its view of the old city, no longer felt safe. The ancient walls outside my window seemed to mock the idea of security. I spent the night on the floor of my building's reinforced stairwell, the designated shelter, along with my neighbors. We were a microcosm of modern Israel, a young secular couple who worked in tech, a family of religious Jews with 4 small children, and an elderly Russian immigrant who sat silently in a corner, her face a mask of stoicism, as if this was just another chapter in a long life of upheaval. The children, too young to understand, cried from fear and confusion. Their parents tried to soothe them with whispered songs, their voices trembling. We were all trapped together in this concrete box, listening to the distant, rhythmic thud of artillery and the scream of jets overhead, each sound a question mark hanging over our collective future. Sometime before dawn, my phone lit up with a secure message. It wasn't from David or Yusuf. It was from a source I had cultivated for my book, a man I'll call M. He was a high-ranking analyst within Israeli military intelligence, a man who lived and breathed the shadow war. We had spoken only a handful of times, always through encrypted channels, never in person. His messages were rare, cryptic, and always significant. This one was 3 words. The order is given. I knew exactly what it meant. The ground incursion. Ari was going in. The debate in the war cabinet was over. The rocket on Jerusalem had been the final argument. I felt a profound sense of powerlessness. I was a writer, an observer, a man of words, but words were useless now. My book, with its central question, detonator or promised land, felt like a naive intellectual exercise in the face of this brutal, unfolding reality. The answer was being written in blood and fire on the rocky hills of southern Lebanon. As the sun rose, a tense calm settled over the city. The government had declared a state of national emergency. Schools were closed, most businesses were shuttered. The streets were eerily empty, patrolled by police and military vehicles. The first official reports from the northern front began to trickle in. The IDF had crossed the border at multiple points under the cover of a massive artillery barrage. The language was sterile, official. Clearing operations are underway, facing stiff resistance, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. But behind the jargon lay the terrifying reality of what was happening to Ari and hundreds of others like him. I couldn't stay in the stairwell any longer. I needed to do something, to bear witness in a more meaningful way than just scrolling through news feeds. I called David. I'm going north, I told him, the decision crystallizing even as I spoke the words. Elias, don't be a fool, he pleaded, his voice ragged with exhaustion. It's a closed military zone. It's incredibly dangerous. What can you possibly do there? I don't know, I admitted honestly. Maybe nothing. But I can't just sit here in a shelter in Jerusalem while your son is. I need to be closer. I need to understand this. For the book, for myself. It was a lie, or at least a partial one. The book was an excuse. The truth was, I felt a desperate, irrational need to be nearer to the center of the storm, as if my proximity could somehow change the outcome, could somehow shield Ari through sheer force of will. It was the desperate logic of love and fear. Using the press credentials I had for my research, I managed to talk my way through a series of checkpoints, heading up the coastal highway toward the Lebanese border. The further north I drove, the more the landscape transformed. The normal life of the country peeled away layer by layer. Civilian cars became scarcer, replaced by convoys of armored personnel carriers, fuel tankers, and flatbed trucks carrying Merkava tanks, their massive cannons pointing north. The air hummed with the constant traffic of helicopters. Some were sleek Apache gunships heading into the fight. Others were lumbering Yasur transport choppers, and a few were medevacs, their red stars stark against their olive-drab fuselages racing south. I knew what they were carrying: the wounded, the dead. I made it as far as a makeshift press center set up in a community center in Nahariya, a coastal city just south of the border. The town was a ghost town, most of its residents evacuated or huddled in shelters. The center was a chaotic hub of international journalists in flak jackets, all clamoring for information from an overworked IDF spokesperson. Here, the war was immediate. We could hear the constant, rolling thunder from across the border. At night, the sky was lit up by explosions, a deadly fireworks display. I interviewed soldiers on brief rotation from the front. They were boys, barely out of their teens, their faces caked with dirt and stubble, their eyes holding a look I'd only ever seen in photographs of old wars, the 1,000-yard stare. They spoke in clipped, exhausted sentences about ambushes, about houses rigged with explosives, about an enemy that was well-trained, well-equipped, and fighting on their home turf. One evening, I was sharing coffee with a veteran Israeli journalist named Ronan, a man who had covered every one of Israel's wars since the 1980s. He looked at me, my American passport, and my earnest notebook, with a kind of weary pity. "You're here for your book, yes?" "The big question," he said, gesturing to the north. "Well, there's your answer. We are both. We have to be the detonator in order to protect the promised land. That is our curse. We have the most powerful army in the Middle East, nuclear weapons, the backing of America. And yet, we are the most vulnerable people on Earth because we live in the toughest neighborhood on the planet, and we are surrounded by people who want to kill us. So we must be ruthless. We must strike first. We must create deterrence. That is the cold, brutal logic that keeps us alive." He pointed to a young soldier staring blankly at a wall. "Ask him about the purity of arms now. Ask him what it's like to clear a house when you don't know if there's a family or a terrorist with a suicide vest behind the door. Ask him about the promised land when he's seen his best friend die in a filthy ditch in a country that isn't his. The promise is paid for every single day by boys like him." The words hit me harder than any explosion. The entire grand narrative of divine promises, geopolitical strategy, and historical destiny was collapsing into the simple, horrific truth of what was being asked of these young men. They were the bridge between the two concepts, the human sacrifice laid on the altar of the state, and Ari was one of them. In the dark, across the border, he was living Ronan's terrible logic, paying the price for the promise. The days in the north bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of fear, adrenaline, and exhaustion. I filled notebooks with observations, with the hollowed-out faces of soldiers and the haunted eyes of evacuated civilians. But I wasn't a journalist anymore. I was a man waiting for a phone call, my stomach twisting into a knot every time my phone buzzed. I sent David and Miriam short, uninformative messages. "Thinking of you. Any news?" Knowing they were in the same purgatory, but in the sterile silence of their Jerusalem apartment, which was somehow worse. Here, at least, the sounds of war provided a grim distraction. The ground offensive was proving to be a bloody slog. Hezbollah was not the ragtag militia of the past. They were a disciplined, heavily armed force that had been preparing for this war for over a decade. Their fighters knew every valley, every cave. They had turned villages into fortresses and laid complex networks of tunnels and booby traps. The IDF was advancing, but the cost was staggering. Every evening, the military spokesperson would read a list of the fallen soldiers' names. The list grew longer each day. Each name was a universe of pain for a family somewhere in Israel. I would listen to the Hebrew names, my heart pounding, praying not to hear the one I knew. One afternoon, seeking a brief respite from the claustrophobic press center, I drove east, toward the hills of the Upper Galilee. I found myself at a kibbutz, one of the communal agricultural settlements that were the bedrock of early Zionism. This one, perched on a ridge overlooking the Hula Valley, had not been fully evacuated. A handful of older, tougher residents had refused to leave. "We didn't survive 48 and 67 to be scared away by some Katyushas," one old farmer told me, his face as cracked and weathered as the soil he worked. From the edge of the kibbutz, you could see Lebanon. It was so close, a tapestry of green and brown hills under a hazy sky. It looked peaceful, beautiful even. But I knew that within those serene-looking hills, Ari and his comrades were fighting for their lives. The farmer followed my gaze. "My grandfather helped drain the swamps in that valley," he said, his voice thick with a Hebrew accent. "They came here with nothing but malaria and a dream. They believed in the promise, not a religious promise, but a human one. A promise of a safe home for our people, a place to work the land and be free." He gestured to the lush fields of the kibbutz, the orchards heavy with fruit. "This is the promised land, right here. The soil, the water, the work of our hands. We built this, and we will defend it." His words, so simple and resolute, stood in stark contrast to the complex geopolitics I'd been immersed in. For him, this wasn't about Iran or proxy wars. It was about defending his home, his farm, the legacy of his grandfather. It was a truth as solid and real as the earth beneath our feet. This was the heart of the Israeli narrative, the pioneer, the builder, the farmer, with a rifle slung over his shoulder, ready to defend the miracle he had wrought from the dust. Then he pointed to a specific hill on the Lebanese side, a small village nestled in a fold of the landscape. That village, before 48, we used to trade with them. My grandfather knew their Mukhtar, their headman. They would share coffee. Sometimes when I look over there, I wonder what happened to his family. I wonder if his great-grandsons are the ones shooting at our sons today. The simple, human connection, severed by the knife of history. The coffee shared between grandfathers had been replaced by the rockets exchanged by grandsons. It was the entire conflict, the entire tragedy, encapsulated in one man's memory. As I drove back to Naharia, my phone finally rang. It was an unknown number, a satellite phone connection, full of static and delay. Elias? The voice was thin, strained, almost unrecognizable, but I knew it. Ari? Ari, is that you? Oh my God, are you okay? I'm okay, he said, his words broken by the static. I borrowed this for 2 minutes. I can't talk long. Where are you? What's happening? A pause. I could hear shouting in the background, the crackle of a radio. It's bad, Elias. It's not what they told us it would be. We lost someone from my team yesterday. Itamar. He was my friend. He choked on the last word. My heart broke for him. Itamar. Another name, another universe extinguished. Ari, listen to me, I said, my voice urgent. Your parents are going out of their minds with worry. Just stay safe. Please, just do what you have to do and come home. Home, he repeated the word, and there was a strange hollow sound in his voice, almost a laugh, but with no humor in it. You know, the other night, we were in this house. We cleared it. It was empty, but they left in a hurry. There was food on the table, a child's drawing on the wall, of a family, holding hands under an olive tree. It looked just like a drawing my little sister made. The static intensified for a moment. I stood there, in this stranger's house, this enemy house, and I looked at that drawing, and all I could think was, they love what's behind them too. Their family, their home, their tree. He was quoting his own words back to me, the words he had spoken with such conviction at the Shabbat table, but now they were infused with a terrible, soul-crushing irony. The purity of arms had met the humanity of the enemy, and it was shattering him. This land, he whispered, his voice fading. Is it promised, Elias, or is it just cursed? The line went dead. I sat in my parked car by the side of the road, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence. The foundation of his belief, the powerful, noble idea that had sustained him, was cracking under the weight of reality. The clear, bright line between the promised land he was defending and the land he was invading had dissolved into a grey, bloody morass. He had gone into Lebanon as a soldier, defending a divine promise, but he was discovering the curse that lay at its very heart, that to secure your own home, you had to destroy someone else's. And in that moment, I feared not just for his life, but for his soul. The war, I realized, inflicted more than just physical wounds. It was waging a battle for the very meaning of Israel, inside the heart of one of its finest sons. Ari's call was the turning point. The war was no longer an external event I was observing, it was an internal crisis I was sharing. His whispered, haunting questions, "Is it promised, or is it just cursed?" became the new title of my manuscript, scrawled on the inside cover of my notebook. The fighting raged on for another week, a brutal war of attrition. The international community, having wrung its hands and issued its condemnations, finally brokered a fragile ceasefire. It was an agreement born of exhaustion, not resolution. The guns fell silent, but the silence was heavy, pregnant with the promise of future conflict. Hezbollah claimed victory for having survived Israel's onslaught. Israel claimed victory for having degraded Hezbollah's capabilities and re-established a security zone. Both sides mourned their dead and quietly prepared for the next round. I drove back to Jerusalem on roads now clogged with military vehicles heading south, away from the front. The tanks on the flatbed trucks were scarred, their armor blackened by explosions. The faces of the soldiers in the back of troop carriers were gaunt, aged by a lifetime of experience crammed into a few hellish weeks. They were the victors, but they didn't look victorious. They looked like survivors of a natural disaster. I found David and Miriam in their apartment. The Shabbat candles were unlit, the home shrouded in a quiet twilight. They had heard from Ari. He was safe. He was at a base in the south, undergoing debriefing. He would be home in a few days. The news was the best they could have hoped for, yet there was no joy in the room, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. We sat in near silence, the unspoken horrors of the past weeks filling the space between us. A few days later, I went with them to the military cemetery at Mount Herzl. It was a clear, beautiful day, the kind of day that felt like a cruel joke. We were there for the funeral of Itamar, the young man from Ari's team. The hillside was a sea of graves, each one topped with a simple stone, a testament to the terrible price of the nation's existence. We stood among hundreds of mourners as Itamar's parents, their bodies racked with a grief so immense it seemed impossible to bear, recited the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer. I saw Ari standing with the other surviving members of his unit, all in their crisp dress uniforms. He was rail-thin, his face a pale, emotionless mask. His eyes, once contemplative, were now vacant, staring at a point somewhere beyond the grave, beyond the hills of Jerusalem. He looked like a stranger. When the ceremony was over, I approached him. He registered my presence, but his gaze remained distant. "Ari," I said softly. He turned to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was a chilling mix of anger and despair. "You see this?" he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. He gestured to the rows upon rows of graves. "This is the price of the promise. Itamar is the price. The boys we killed are the price. The drawing on that wall is the price. And for what? So we can do this all over again in 5 years, 10 years. He looked at his parents, who were standing a short distance away, their faces etched with sorrow. "My father, he believes this is a miracle. My mother, she believes it's a prayer. They need to believe that. But I was there. I was the instrument of the miracle. I was the answer to the prayer, and it felt like a curse." He was no longer the idealistic boy from the Shabbat dinner. The war had burned that boy away, leaving this hard, wounded man in his place. He had seen the irreconcilable truths collide, and the collision had broken something inside him. I left Jerusalem a week later. My manuscript lay unfinished in my bag. The city felt different to me now. I could no longer see just the golden stones. I saw the fault lines running through them. I could no longer hear just the call to prayer. I heard the echo of sirens. I went to say goodbye to Youssef. He was in his shop, the shutters up, the familiar scent of cardamom in the air, as if the war had been just a bad dream. "So, you are leaving us," he said, handing me the customary cup of coffee. "For now," I replied. "I need distance." "Distance does not change the truth," he said gently. "You have seen it now, with your own eyes. This land demands a choice. You must believe in the promise so fiercely that you are willing to become the detonator. Or you must see the curse so clearly that the promise turns to ash in your mouth. There is no middle ground here." He was right. That was the impossible choice this land demanded of its children, of Ari, of the boys who had pursued the stone throwers, of everyone trapped in its gravitational pull. As my plane climbed out of Tel Aviv, banking over the Mediterranean, I looked down at the coastline of Israel, a tiny sliver of land pressed against a vast, hostile region. From 30,000 feet, you couldn't see the walls, the checkpoints, or the graves. You could only see the lights, a brilliant constellation of human endeavor shining in the darkness. It looked beautiful. It looked peaceful. It looked like a promise. But I knew the truth now. The title of my book was not a question with two possible answers. It was a single, terrifying identity. Israel was the promised land, a dream of 2 millennia, a miracle of survival and revival. And precisely because it was the promised land, held with such fierce, desperate and sacred conviction, it was also the detonator, a place where ancient faith and modern firepower were locked in a fatal embrace, forever threatening to set the world ablaze. The promise was the curse. The hope was the danger. And the question was no longer which one it was, but how long the world could survive their perfect, tragic union.